Okay, so we've done the first 3 units online. I think it'd be a good time to take a minute right here. Let's review where we've come for before we move on to Unit 4. So what we've really been talking about is evidence-based practice and what that all means, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit, review a little bit about evidence-based practice. I'm going to hopefully clear up any of the questions or problems you have with it, and I'm going to use a real-life example, see if we can go forward at it. So what we're going to do now is let's review a quick PowerPoint on evidence-based practice and make sure we're on the same page. Okay, so here we are back in the PowerPoint world, and I did a quick Google search of evidence-based practice, and I'm a pretty visual guy, so I just want to look at different models and see how different models are kind of examining it. And here are just 4 really quick ones I downloaded, but you can see they all have basically the same components to it. You have the evidence here, you have the patient values here, and you have the clinical expertise here. And all 3 of these have to be weighted, have to be appreciated, and then you get your outcomes in the middle, right? In this one over here to the right, you can see you take the best research available, but then you take the practitioner expertise, and you're the practitioner. The big thing I want you to take away from the EpiPen exercise is that you are the clinician, you are the practitioner. So I didn't want you to put yourself in the position of the mom or put yourself in the position of the EMT. I wanted you to put yourself in a position of you. If you were in that situation, in that house, in that room, and you saw Cameron having an allergic reaction, what would you do? And the other thing that's interesting here, and I think it does a nice job, is talking about the client or the patient, their characteristics, their state of mind, their needs, their values, their preferences. And the bottom line is, from the EpiPen example, you got to assume that Cameron wanted to live, and he would have wanted to have everything and anything done to help save his life. All right, and that is probably the one aspect of evidence-based practice that can be the hardest, because you're trying to read another person's thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, their preferences, and sometimes we get kind of lost in that. But it's still really important to understand. So that being said, I have a real-life example that I am currently living with that I'm going to use to see if I can really illustrate evidence-based practice a little more for you. Okay, so here we go for a real-life example that maybe some of you have experienced also. Okay, so this is my 4.5-month-old child, Tobias, okay? My first child, so I'm still trying to learn on the job about this situation. So this is Tobias, and typically he's a pretty happy kid. Matter of fact, he's really happy. He likes to smile, he likes to carry on, and I'm still working on the job how to handle it, but for the most part, we love this little guy. But here's the problem. Every now and then, Tobias wants to fall asleep. And we want him to fall asleep, and we like it when he falls asleep. And anyone out there who's a parent understands we want our children to sleep. But here's the problem. Sometimes Tobias doesn't want to fall asleep, and he cries, and he screams, and he carries on, and we're left in a conundrum. What to do when you know your baby has to sleep, but they're crying. And that leads us to a controversy that's happening right now, and that's the crying it out. Should you let your babies cry it out in order to fall asleep? So I did a quick Google search. You can see this screenshot right here, crying it out. And we talked in Unit 3 about using proper sources and how to look through the library, etc. So this is not the best way to do it, but it's a really quick and dirty way to kind of look at what's out there. And you can see 218 million results, a lot of different sources here. But the interesting one is if I went to this Psychology Today, they cited an article that cited an article that cited an article, and I was able to track that article down on the dangers of crying it out. And when I tracked the article down, I came up with this. And you can read the abstract there, you can go through it, but the bottom line of it is they were testing cortisol levels, and cortisol levels are an indicator of stress. And so elevated cortisol, you're highly stressed. So what they did was they brought these babies in, these 25 infants, and they brought them into the lab, and they had the moms with them, and the moms engaged in what's called extinction crime, which means you don't pick up the baby. You let them, quote unquote, cry it out. And what they saw was, yes, after 3 days, the babies did fall asleep. That when they realized that no one was going to come and pick them up, they fell asleep on their own. But the interesting thing in the study showed that their cortisol levels remained high. So even though they weren't expressing distress, their cortisol levels were saying physiologically they were distressed. So if you read through the lines of this article, crying it out is dangerous. It keeps elevated cortisol levels. Oh no, we're hurting our children. Well, I dug a little deeper into the evidence and I came up with this. This is a systematic review that came from the Journal of Sleep. So this is from the sleep people. The other one is from the pediatric people. This is from the sleep people. What they said in this article was that they reviewed 52 studies. It's a systematic review. And they found there is absolutely no problems, no long-term, no short-term issues with extinction or graduated extinction treatments. So what this study shows is crying it out is not so dangerous. So what we have here is we have evidence which is contradictory in nature, saying one thing and then saying the other, and I don't know who to rely on. If I'm going to use evidence-based practice to make a decision on whether I want my son to cry it out to have him fall asleep, the evidence is contradictory. I don't know what to do anymore. So when you look at your evidence-based model right here, the evidence is just a bunch of question marks. I don't know what to do. My individual clinical expertise is blank. I've never done this before. So I don't even know what to do with this. So I have to rely on the evidence. And if the evidence is contradictory, what do? And obviously the patient's value, which would be my son, he wants to be picked up, right? He wants to be soothed. He wants his mom. His expectation is someone's going to take care of him. So his expectation is pick me up. The evidence doesn't have an overwhelming decision. So it's up to me to try to weigh these two and come up with what I think I should do for my child. And if anyone's a parent, anyone's seen this, this is something that we have to struggle with. And I still don't know if I have a really good answer for it. So when you put it all together, I don't know if I'm doing it right by my child. I kind of read the evidence. It's leaning one way, it's leaning the other. I know what he wants as the baby to be picked up. But I also know, honestly, I kind of want to let him cry it out and see if he sleeps it out. And that's the decision we went with. We're using sort of this graduated extinction method, and it seems to be working out for us. Luckily, Tobias is sleeping, and if we're causing long-term harm, I honestly don't know. But that's sort of what you get when you talk about evidence-based practice. Sometimes it's clear-cut, like the EpiPen example. Okay, we saw the evidence, it was pretty clear-cut. You can use it, you're not going to cause a lot of harm. We should have probably done it with the person anaphylactic shock. Sometimes it's more of a gray area like this where we're dealing with. And as we progress through this course, I'm going to have you reading a lot of research studies and going through a lot of the literature. And you're going to notice that some of the studies are not as cut and dry. They're not as clean as you thought they were. So it's really going to be to you, the clinician, the reader, the consumer of the information, to come up with what you feel is the best decision possible. That might not always be the right one. In hindsight, it might turn out to be a poor one, but you can only make the decision based on the amount of information you have.